but she had some very horrible injuries to her. And listen, it was nothing natural. You're Jewel's mom. You need to stick up for her, okay? Jewel was hurt. She had there were several bruises and abrasions on her, okay?
What is abrasion?
Well, like little cuts to the skin and stuff like that. She had bruises on her head. She had some bruising on her head. She had some bruising on her butt, some bruises on her back. That's what the doctor said. She was bleeding internally.
How? Okay. I don't understand this. Like, I don't understand
Okay,
this. Like,
let me try to explain to you, okay?
What happened? I need to know what happened.
Okay, I'm going to try to explain that to you, okay? The injury that happened here in the abdomen, it basically ruptured her liver.
On a warm spring afternoon in Sarasota, 3-year-old Jewel Renee Howard sat laughing on her grandmother's porch, her hair freshly braided with pink and purple beads. She played joyfully with neighborhood children, talking excitedly about becoming a princess one day. It was a picture of innocent childhood, a little girl with big dreams and a loving family who adored her. Yet less than 15 hours later, that same bubbly child lay lifeless in a hospital bed, her tiny body broken by unimaginable violence. The next morning, April 11th, 2013, Jewel was pronounced dead from massive internal injuries, her liver torn and crushed, her ribs shattered, and her belly filled with blood. In the blink of an eye, the bright future she dreamed of was brutally stolen. Her paternal grandmother, Tiffany Howard, who had often cared for Jewel, was devastated. Just the day before, Grandma Tiffany had held Jewel in her lap, fixing those colorful beads in her hair and listening to the toddler giggle about princesses. Now this loving grandmother could only scream in grief. Every night since, Tiffany has found herself lying awake, asking out loud, "How could this have happened to my baby?" It's a question that haunts not only Jewel's family, but an entire community, a question made all the more painful by the knowledge that warning signs were missed and opportunities to save Jewel were squandered. This is the true story of Jewel Howard's tragic death, a story of heartbreaking suffering and the failures of the very people who should have protected her. Long before that fatal night, there were ominous signs that Jewel was in danger. Weeks prior to her death, Jewel showed up with a deep cut on her lip that required stitches. When her biological father gently asked what happened, the bright-eyed little girl bravely confided that Mummy's boyfriend hit me in the face, hard enough to split her lip open. The idea that anyone, let alone a caregiver, would punch a toddler was sickening. Jewel's father was horrified and reported the incident, desperate to keep his daughter safe. He wasn't alone in his concern. Florida's Department of Children and Families, DCF, was alerted and opened an investigation on March 5, 2013, after discovering Jewel's injury. On paper, the system was now aware that Jewel's home life was not as normal as it appeared. Tragically, DCF's response was sluggish and ineffective. Despite the serious allegation that Jewel had been physically abused by her mother's boyfriend, no decisive action was taken to remove or protect her in the ensuing weeks. Both Jewel's mother, 21-year-old Asia Sheree Rosier, and Asia's boyfriend Jumar Edwards had troubling histories of violence, with multiple prior arrests between them. Asia's arrest record included 5 separate incidents for violent offenses, even an aggravated battery charge, and Jumar's recent arrests were for battery. These were not people with the patience or gentleness needed to care for a fragile young child. DCF knew about their backgrounds, and they knew about Jewel's busted lip. In fact, child abuse investigators had instructed Asia that Jumar was not allowed to live in her home while the abuse investigation was ongoing. But Asia ignored that order, and DCF failed to enforce it. Instead of intervening swiftly, the authorities allowed Jewel to remain in this dangerous environment while they looked into the case. Weeks ticked by without concrete protection for the toddler. Those were precious weeks that Jewel did not have to spare. Family members later recounted other red flags in the household. Jewel often seemed hungry and unkempt when relatives saw her, as if basic care was lacking. Asia, a young single mother of 2, Jewel and an infant son, appeared overwhelmed and more focused on her new boyfriend than on her children. Neglect hung over the household, not just in the physical sense, but in the emotional distance that seemed to exist between Asia and her daughter. Still, Jewel was a resilient and loving child. She adored her mum and was always eager to please, even as she bore bruises that a 3-year-old should never have. Neighbors and relatives worried, but they hoped DCF's involvement meant things would improve. Sadly, their hope was misplaced. On April 10, 2013, the day after playing happily at Grandma's, Jewel was back at the small house on Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Way in Sarasota, that her mother shared with Jumar. That evening, Jewel fell gravely ill, or so her mother claimed. Asia would later say that Jewel had been having asthma troubles that night. In fact, earlier that day, Jewel had been seen for an asthma treatment, and afterward she vomited and complained of pain. These symptoms could have been warnings that something was very wrong internally, but Asia and Jumar didn't treat it like an emergency. Instead, as Jewel grew weak and started whimpering in pain, the couple lied to a concerned family friend about the situation. A close friend of Asia's, noticing Jewel's distress, urged them to get the child to a doctor immediately. Something was clearly wrong. The little girl's breathing was labored, and she kept crying that her tummy hurt. In response to the friend's pleas, Asia and Jumar insisted they had it under control. They claimed they were on their way to take Jewel to a scheduled doctor's appointment that evening. Relieved, the friend left, trusting that the young mother and her boyfriend would do the right thing. But this was a lie. No doctor's visit ever happened. Instead of rushing their injured child to the hospital, Asia and Jumar stayed home with Jewel all night. What happened during those dark hours behind closed doors remains unclear. What is clear is that Jewel's condition spiraled from bad to worse. Through the night, neighbors later reported hearing muffled cries and thumps from the Rosier house. Perhaps in pain and frightened, Jewel likely cried for her mummy. Perhaps those cries were met with anger or indifference. By the next morning, April 11, 2013, Jewel Howard was fighting for her life. She was limp, unable to walk or even stand. A witness later described the toddler as flopping around uncontrollably, drifting in and out of consciousness. Around 10 a.m., the same family friend from the night before came by to check on Jewel. What she found was every caregiver's nightmare. Jewel's small body was pale and unresponsive, her eyes half open yet not seeing. Panicked, the friend begged Asia and Jumar to call 911 immediately. Unbelievably, the couple hesitated. They seemed more worried about themselves than about Jewel's dire state. A heated argument erupted in the house as the friend screamed that Jewel needed a hospital now, while Asia and Jumar resisted, concocting excuses. They had already delayed all night long and Jewel's life was ebbing away with each passing second. Finally, at around 10:30 a.m., the friend could wait no more. She pushed past their excuses and dialed 911 herself. Paramedics rushed to the address, sirens blaring, but by the time they arrived, little Jewel was no longer breathing. In those critical last moments, nobody in that house had even attempted CPR on the child. The 911 operator, straining to guide someone over the phone to help the toddler, was met with chilling inaction. On the recorded call you can hear chaos and panic, but no sounds of anyone actually doing CPR or trying to resuscitate Jewel. Asia Rosier, the child's own mother, did not perform mouth-to-mouth. Jumar Edwards, who claimed to care about Jewel, did nothing but pace nervously. They simply waited for the ambulance as Jewel's life slipped away. Paramedics found Jewel unresponsive on the floor. They scooped up the tiny girl and raced to Sarasota Memorial Hospital, fighting desperately to revive her on the way. But it was too late. Jewel Renee Howard was pronounced dead shortly after arrival at the hospital, only 3 years and 8 months old. A little girl who had been giggling on her grandma's lap the day before was now gone, leaving behind only questions and agony. The emergency doctors examining Jewel were stunned and horrified by what they found. This wasn't an asthma attack at all. It was a massacre of a child's insides. The autopsy performed the very next day revealed the full extent of Jewel's injuries. She had died from blunt force trauma to her abdomen, which caused a lacerated and crushed liver, massive internal bleeding, and other catastrophic internal injuries. In short, someone had beaten this child to death. The medical examiner also documented 2 broken ribs and multiple fresh bruises across Jewel's tiny body, injuries that were not the result of any CPR or life-saving efforts. These were deliberate injuries. The examiner classified the death as the result of homicidal violence, a term that made it painfully clear that Jewel had been attacked with brutal force. Detectives from the Sarasota County Sheriff's Office immediately launched a homicide investigation. They faced a perplexing and frustrating situation. The only 2 adults with Jewel during the fatal time frame were Asia Rosier and Jumar Edwards. Either one of them, or both, knew exactly what happened to that little girl. But from the start, Asia and Jumar were deceptive and evasive. During police interrogations, Asia stuck to a story that defied belief. She told investigators that Jewel had been feeling sick from asthma and simply suddenly died for no apparent reason. She pretended to be baffled, even going so far as to express relief that an autopsy would be done to find out what really happened. In one interview with a doctor, Asia absurdly claimed that she had asked her 3-year-old daughter whether she wanted to go to the hospital, and that Jewel had said no. This outrageous excuse left police and medical staff slack-jawed, What mother lets a toddler decide if she should go to the ER? Asia's own words painted a picture of a woman who utterly failed to protect her child. This is a grown adult woman, the prosecutor would later say of Asia's inaction, incredulous that Asia tried to blame her toddler's supposed reluctance for the failure to seek help. Jumar Edwards also spun lies. Initially, Asia tried to cover for Jumar, telling detectives that Jumar wasn't even present at the house that night. This was quickly exposed as a lie. Not only did witnesses place Jumar at the scene, but records showed Jumar effectively lived there despite an active DCF order barring him from the home. When confronted, Asia admitted Jumar was around but downplayed his involvement. For his part, Jumar denied harming Jumar and claimed he didn't notice anything wrong with her until it was too late. He coldly stated that he thought Jumar just had a stomach bug. Neither of them would explain how Jumar's liver came to be ripped apart that night. Investigators were certain that one or both of these adults had violently assaulted Jewel, but proving it would be another matter. There were no other witnesses to the fatal blow, and both suspects insisted Jewel hadn't been abused that night. The physical evidence, the pattern of internal injuries, strongly suggested punches or kicks to the abdomen. Detectives noticed that Asia had a history of anger and violence, and Jumar too was known for his temper. In fact, Jumar's presence in the home was itself a violation of the safety plan in place. This raised a chilling possibility. If DCF had removed Jewel or enforced the no-contact order for Jumar, this tragedy might have been averted. Instead, here they were, piecing together a murder with uncooperative suspects. When pressed harder, Asia's facade began to crack. Police records later revealed that she changed her story multiple times. At one point, Asia insinuated that Jewel might have been injured earlier in the day somewhere else, perhaps implying an accident at the playground or at her grandmother's, though Jewel had been perfectly healthy at Grandma's just hours before. Jumar's attorney would later float a theory that Jewel suffered a concussion earlier and that her caregivers couldn't have known she was slowly dying internally. But investigators weren't buying these tales. They noticed, for instance, that Asia never mentioned her daughter's split lip incident or the ongoing DCF investigation during her interviews. She conveniently left out that crucial context. It was as if she hoped the police wouldn't dig into the past, into the pattern of abuse that Jewel had already suffered. Throughout the interrogations, one agonizing question loomed. Who delivered the fatal blows to Jewel? Was it her mother, Asia, snapping under the stress of a crying child? Or was it Jumar, the boyfriend with a known violent streak, lashing out at a little girl he saw as an inconvenience? Or did both share the blame, one striking the child, the other refusing to seek help until it was too late? Investigators had their suspicions, but without a confession or eyewitness, they faced the prospect that Jewel's killer might never be definitively identified. It is a testament to how horribly Jewel was failed, first by abusive caretakers, and then by the scant evidence left behind, that even in death the full truth remained elusive. In the immediate aftermath of Jewel's death, the Sarasota County Sheriff's Office arrested Asia Rosier and Jumar Edwards. Initially, they were each charged with felony child neglect, causing great bodily harm. Charges that recognized their willful failure to get life-saving help for Jewel. The community was outraged that neglect was the only charge. Many believed both should face murder or manslaughter charges, but prosecutors had to proceed with what they could prove, that these two had knowingly allowed a gravely injured child to languish without medical care, resulting in her death. Asia and Jumar were held in jail without bond, as Jewel's family prepared to bury a beloved child who had barely begun to live. News of Jewel Howard's tragic death spread beyond Sarasota, highlighting a pattern of failure in Florida's child welfare system. It turned out that Jewel was not the only child to die recently under DCF's watch. In the 6-week span around Jewel's death, 4 small children with prior DCF involvement died tragic, preventable deaths, sparking a statewide scandal. The head of Florida's DCF, the very agency tasked with protecting children like Jewel, resigned in disgrace amid the outcry, as it was revealed that the child death toll was far higher than officials had publicly admitted. Jewel Howard's name became one of many in a grim roster of children failed by the system. Public outrage grew as details emerged. DCF had known Jewel was at risk and still left her in harm's way. Lawmakers and child advocates demanded to know how this could happen, and whether changes in policy or personnel could prevent the next innocent life from being lost. Sadly, those questions came too late for Jewel. Back in Sarasota, Asia Rosier and Jumar Edwards faced trial in January 2014. In the courtroom, prosecutors did not mince words. They painted Asia and Jumar as callous caretakers who put their own freedom above the life of a little girl. The jury was shown heartbreaking photos of Jewel's internal injuries and bruises. Expert witnesses confirmed that had Jewel received prompt medical attention, even as late as that morning, she might have survived. Instead, Asia made no genuine attempt to save her daughter's life. Prosecutor Karen Freiwillig argued that any reasonable person would have seen that Jewel was in distress and needed a hospital. The defense in turn stuck to their claims that the couple simply didn't realize the severity of Jewel's condition. Asia's attorney described her as a busy young mother with a chronically ill child who tragically mistook an internal injury for a routine asthma flare-up. Juma's attorney insisted there were no obvious external injuries and that the pair weren't psychic. They couldn't have known Jewel was bleeding to death internally. These excuses rang hollow, especially in light of evidence that Jewel had been visibly suffering for hours and that multiple people had urged them to get help. The prosecutor reminded jurors that even the defense's own medical expert conceded Jewel's symptoms warranted an immediate ER visit. During the trial, disturbing new details came to light. Jurors learned that Asia had lied repeatedly during the investigation, including her attempt to hide Juma's presence. They also heard that Asia's 5-month-old son, Jewel's baby brother, was removed from her custody the day Jewel died, thankfully placed into protective care before he could share his sister's fate. The weight of evidence and testimony was overwhelming. While the exact circumstances of the fatal blows remained murky, what was crystal clear is that Asia Rosier and Juma Edwards did nothing to save a dying child under their care. After a week-long trial, the jury delivered its verdict. Asia Rosier and Juma Edwards were found guilty on felony child neglect charges in the death of Jewel Howard. The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read. Asia began to sob, while Juma stared at the floor. They each faced up to 15 years in state prison for this conviction. At the sentencing hearing, Jewel's family members spoke through tears about the bright, affectionate little girl they lost. Jewel's father stood in court, voice shaking with sorrow and anger, and asked why his daughter was not saved when there had been so many chances. The judge, visibly moved and stern, condemned the pair for their negligence. In 2014, both Asia and Juma were sentenced to lengthy prison terms on the order of a decade behind bars for their role in Jewel's death. The judge's words were scathing. "Your child depended on you for life, and you turned your back on her. That is something you will have to live with for the rest of your lives." Neither Asia nor Juma offered any genuine apology that day. They had both maintained in their own ways that they simply didn't know Jewel was in mortal danger. In the years that followed, Jewel Howard's memory continues to ache in the hearts of those who loved her. A tiny purple princess dress hung untouched in her grandmother's closet, the dress Jewel never got to wear. The neighborhood on MLK Jr. Way remembers the sirens of that awful morning, and the sight of paramedics carrying out a small limp body. A little roadside memorial of stuffed animals and candles grew outside the house where Jewel died, as stunned neighbors tried to process how this could happen. The case also left an imprint on Florida's child welfare policies. Under intense public pressure, DCF undertook internal reforms to better respond to abuse reports and to remove endangered children more swiftly. But reforms on paper are cold comfort to Jewel's grieving relatives. They know that for every success story of a child rescued in time, there was a Jewel, a little girl who fell through the cracks and paid with her life. Heartbreakingly, Asia Rosier's life moved on, even as Jewel's was cut short. After serving several years in prison, Asia was released back into society in late 2021, granted the chance to rebuild her life under probation supervision. By 2025, Asia, now in her early 30s, walked free, even cultivating a presence on social media, as if trying to wipe away the stain of the past. The fact that Jewel's mother can post selfies and garner online followers today is a bitter pill for those who remember the horrific circumstances of Jewel's death. It feels like a profound injustice that the woman who failed to save her child now gets a second chance at life, while Jewel will never get a second chance at anything. Juma Edwards likewise served his time and presumably will one day regain freedom, if he hasn't already. For many, the idea of these two moving on with their lives is infuriating and painful, a reminder that the scales of justice can never truly balance when a child's life has been taken. In the end, the story of Jewel Howard stands as a harrowing cautionary tale. It is the story of a beautiful little girl who loved noodles and princesses, who had a family that adored her, and who suffered terribly at the hands of those entrusted to protect her. It is the story of systemic failings, of warning signs dismissed and bureaucratic delays that cost precious time. It is the story of a mother whose dereliction of duty proved as lethal as any weapon, and of a man whose violence and selfishness snuffed out an innocent life. Most of all, it is the story of an irreparable loss. There is an ache that accompanies any thought of how much pain Jewel endured in her final hours, and how frightened she must have been. The only sliver of solace is imagining that somewhere in her last conscious moments, she might have remembered the feeling of her grandmother's arms braiding her hair the day before, and the sound of loving voices telling her she was a princess. The world will never get to see Jewel Howard grow up, never see her don a real princess gown or start school or laugh on the playground. All we can do is remember her and hope that her tragic story compels us to do better, to listen to the cries of children like Jewel before it's too late.